Remember, bone is also a type of connective tissue. So bone is made up of cells called osteocytes. Remember, osteo refers to bone, cyte is cell. So here we have an osteocyte. The osteocyte is also going to be in a little area known as a lacuna. And then the extracellular matrix. Remember, connective tissue is made up of connective tissues are made up of an extracellular matrix and the cells that are within it. So the extracellular matrix in osseous tissue or bone has become calcified. So it's a very hard extracellular matrix. So bone tissue is made up of two different types of bone. Compact bone, which is made up of sort of tree ring-like structures that are known as osteons. So when we get into the study of bone, we'll learn about the different structures that make up the compact bone versus the spongy bone, and you'll see that each one of these has a different place that it's found in the body and serves a different function. So for right now, just know that your compact bone is going to be the harder bone. So it's the outside of all bones and makes up the biggest part of long bones, such as the femur. By contrast, your spongy bone is more like a sponge. So it's made up of little structures that intersect with each other and form these thin little columns of bone called trabeculae. The space between your trabeculae are going to be filled with bone marrow. So compact, think tightly packed together, made up of osteons, which is just like tree rings and tree rings and tree rings all together, very tightly packed together and makes for a strong bone. Spongy bone, just little columns all stacked together at intersections, filled with all these spaces that then contain red bone marrow, so much more fragile. So you find these throughout the body, with the compact bone, of course, again, forming the outer surface of all bones and making up most of the shaft or the long part of a long bone. So what does bone do? Well, obviously it supports the body, but it also helps to protect the body, such as the skull or the bones of the ribs, protecting the underlying organs. Bone also functions to storage, so it stores calcium so that we can go in and break down a little bit of bone tissue if blood calcium gets low. That red bone marrow also is where our blood forming tissue is. So we have blood stem cells in there that constantly make new erythrocytes, red blood cells and white blood cells and platelets for us. And then, of course, the bone is going to act as an attachment point for muscles. So when those muscles contract, the body can move. Blood is a liquid connective tissue. So the cells found within the blood are your erythrocytes or red blood cells, your white blood cells, also called leukocytes, which are your immune system cells, and your platelets, which are tiny little fragments of cells, such as these that you see. So they're tiny little pieces. So blood consists of plasma and formed elements. So the matrix of this connective tissue is the plasma, the liquid part of the blood. The cells are the leukocytes, the red blood cells, and your white blood cells, your red blood cells, and your platelets. So the job of the red blood cells is to carry oxygen. The role of the white blood cells is immunity, to protect you, and your platelets also protect you because they cause blood clotting so that when you cut yourself, you don't bleed out. Your platelets stop that bleeding. Okay? So where is it found? Well, it's pretty obvious. Blood is found in the blood vessels, so the arteries and the veins, and the smaller arteries called arterioles and smaller veins called venules, and then the tiniest little vessels known as capillaries. We also find blood in the chambers of the heart. So the function, as I mentioned, red blood cells transport respiratory gases. White blood cells, that's your immune system. And your platelets are responsible for blood clotting. All right, so that finishes up our connective tissues. Let's take a brief look now at the muscle tissue. Remember our 4 tissue types: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. So now we're looking at the third type of tissue, which is the muscular tissue. Muscular tissue, if you remember, is composed of 3 different types of tissue, so the category has 3 different types. Skeletal muscle is made up of long, cylindrical, striated muscle cells that are called muscle fibers. When you look at a muscle fiber or a muscle cell, you can see it appears striated or striped in its appearance. These can vary in length depending on where they're found in the body. Most skeletal muscle cells are also going to be multinucleated, which means they have more than one nucleus, and their job is to contract. So skeletal muscle is considered the voluntary muscle. So it's typically the muscles you think of and those that you see, such as your pectoralis major here in the chest, and the deltoid, and the biceps brachii, your abdominal muscles and the muscles in your leg. Those muscles that you contract at will are made up of skeletal muscle tissue. So they're usually going to be found where they attach to bones by connective tissues known as tendons. Their job is to move the body, to maintain posture by some of these muscles maintaining a partial state of contraction. They also help to protect the body because they provide a part of covering that surrounds your organs and part of your body structure. And then your muscles produce heat. We mentioned this in our earlier discussion. When a muscle cell contracts, it burns that ATP. And I say burn very loosely in that it simply means we're breaking chemical bonds. Just like the motor of your car breaks the chemical bonds in gasoline, when your skeletal muscles contract, or when any muscle contracts, it's breaking chemical bonds in ATP. Cardiac muscle cell is found within the heart. So anytime you see cardiac or cardio, think heart. So branched and also striated muscle cells, usually though only one nucleus. These are going to attach together at areas called intercalated disc. So here you can see an intercalated disc. Here you see intercalated disc. These intercalated discs are made up of desmosomes and gap junctions. Remember, desmosomes form those little spot wells where fibers from one cell interweave into the area of another cell, and they hold those cells together. Remember, heart muscle is contracting from the moment that heart is made until the moment you die. So those desmosomes give strength to that tissue, so the fibers hold together during those contractions. The gap junctions form those little passageways between adjacent cells and allows for ions. Remember, ions are charged particles that allow for conduction of electrical currents, which causes those muscle cells to contract throughout the heart. Also remember, the cardiac muscle cell is involuntary, which means you have no conscious control. There are autorhythmic cells in the heart that are going to contract without nervous system control, but only as long as there is sufficient energy and ATP and other chemicals found in the blood. So if you take a heart out of the body, the cardiac muscles will continue to contract for a few minutes. Now that won't go in long, so I don't recommend you try it. So where do you find cardiac muscle cell? In the heart wall. And what is its function? To contract and push blood out of the heart through these large vessels out to the body. Smooth muscle tissue is made up of non-striated fibers. Okay? The muscle cells themselves are not long cylinders, but they're somewhat spindle-shaped. So they're thicker in the middle and they taper off each end. Single centrally located nucleus, so one nucleus located sort of in the center in the fat part of the body. These are involuntary, which means that you don't control their contraction. And you find these types of cells in the irises of the eye, in the walls of the internal structures, such as your blood vessels and your gastrointestinal passageways, and in the uterus. So muscle cells still function to contract. So when these muscles contract, they're moving things throughout the body, not moving the body like we saw with skeletal muscle. So when the smooth muscle in your blood vessels contract, then the blood vessels get smaller and increase the blood pressure. when the smooth muscle of the gastrointestinal passageway contracts. It moves that food after you swallow through the intestinal tract. And our fourth type of tissue is nervous tissue. So nervous tissue consists primarily of neurons and neuroglial cells. So neurons are what we think of as nerve cells. So they consist of a cell body, also called a soma, and processes that extend off of the cell body. So these processes are known as dendrites. So you can think of them as the receivers. They receive a stimulus and bring it into the cell body. Within the cell body, we also have the nucleus and the normal organelles that are found within other cells. And then there's a single long extension coming off that is known as an axon. So if an action potential or a nerve impulse is going to occur, once that stimulus is received from the dendrite, processed in the cell body, then that action potential or nerve impulse will travel down the axon to the next cell, which is then going to be stimulated to do something. The neuroglial cells don't have that same job, so they don't receive or conduct nerve impulses, but they support the neurons. So they may function to clean up the environment around the neuron by getting rid of cellular debris or waste products. They may also secrete some of the fluids that are found within the nervous system, such as the cerebrospinal fluid. Some of the cells, such as astrocytes, are going to connect blood vessels to some of the nervous tissue. So they say your neuroglial cells are there primarily for support. But oftentimes when a tumor develops in the brain, it's most commonly found in some of those neuroglial cells or originating from those neuroglial cells. So what's the location of the nervous tissue? Pretty simple. Found in the nervous system, the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves that go from the brain and spinal cord out to the body, and from the body back into the brain and spinal cord. So the function, of course, is to respond to a stimulus and convert that stimulus into an action. So conduct nerve impulses from the body and from areas within the body to the brain and the spinal cord where it's processed, and then can cause an action to occur in other nerve cells or muscle cells or glands or other areas throughout the body.